Space Engineers 2 Vertical Slice 2 Survival Foundations and Planets has finally been released. And the number one question I know everyone wants to know is, should I get the game now? Is it worth getting yet? Etc, etc. And the answer is, it depends. Full disclosure, I have had early access to the update for the past 2 weeks, and I have had an absolute blast with everything I've experienced so far. However, I know that everyone has their own different tastes and interests, so we're going through everything you need to know so you can decide for yourself if you want to get it. And whilst we'll be going through everything added in this update in depth momentarily, the most important thing to note is that Space Engineers 2 is still in early access, so do not go into it and expect a full experience, and do not expect the game to be a complete polished product. You will find features that are missing or incomplete, you may find performance issues, and you may find bugs. Space Engineers 1 is still the game you want to play if you want a full experience, and it's still receiving updates to this day, with it actually receiving a new update last week. However, with all that said, Space Engineers 2's new update has brought a substantial amount of new gameplay to the game, and the new survival features are a massive step up from Space Engineers 1. So if you want to test it out and mess around with some of the amazing new features and systems, the game is available now for you to do so. So with that out of the way, let's go through everything new in this update in depth, and there's timestamps below if you want to skip to any particular feature of the update. Vertical Slice 2 is the Survival Foundations and Planets update, and with the Survival Foundations being a bit more substantial, we'll cover those second, so let's look at planets first. The update adds 3 celestial bodies, 2 planets and 1 star. The first planet is called Verdure, and it is an Earth-like planet, very similar to the Earth-like planet in Space Engineers 1, just looking 1,000 times better. Every single area of this planet looks like a beautiful screenshot. It has a number of biomes: tundra, taiga, forest, hills, mountains, savanna, desert, volcanic regions, and it also has beaches and riverbeds and ocean beds for when water is added to the game in a future update. The planet also has a number of what the developers are calling natural wonders, which are parts of the planet's surface which are based on real life locations. There's areas based on the Grand Canyon and the Atacama Desert, and in future, when water is added to the game, there'll also be waterfalls and deep sea trenches based on real life locations as well. Graphically, Verdure is a beautiful planet. It looks so good, 1,000 times better than Space Engineers 1, and it makes a fantastic backdrop to the new survival mode of the game. Kemik is the second planet, and it is very much Mars-like in theme, with having a mixture of flat, barren areas and also mountainous areas as well. And within those mountainous areas, you'll find many different volcanoes across the surface. Like on Verdure, there is also natural wonders. There's this skull formation on the planet, which is based on the alleged face seen in the Cydonia region of Mars. There is also a giant volcano on Kemik, which is based on Olympus Mons, which is the tallest mountain in our solar system. And there's also this extremely large impact crater on Kemik as well. I'm not really sure if this is a reference to anything. Perhaps it's related to the lore of the game. We'll have to wait and see. But overall, Kemik has much more interesting geography than just the flat orange planet we had in Space Engineers 1. And finally, the third celestial object added in this update is Delfos, which is a brown dwarf star which is at the centre of our playable star system in Space Engineers 2. Delfos doesn't really do anything at the moment, it's more just a pretty thing in the background for you to see. If you fly up to it, you just fly straight through it, as, well, it's not really supposed to be solid, it's like a big gas giant. But in the future, the developers have said that Delfos will have a damage field around it, presumably due to the heat that it gives off. Or perhaps it could be a lore-related reason. I have my theories, but we'll save those for a later video. Don't forget to subscribe to see that. Anyway, there's more to planets than just how pretty they are. One of the new features of planets, which I very much enjoy, is a new fracturing system for both rocks and trees. If you hit a rock or a tree with a ship, or with a debug gun if you cheat, the trees will fracture into pieces and all the little branches will fall off, and if you hit a rock, it shatters to pieces, with bits of the rock going everywhere. Obviously this is much better than Space Engineers 1, where you hit a tree and then the whole tree fell over, and most games don't really have destruction like this anymore. On the same topic of destruction, there's a new feature called Dynamic Voxel Hardness, which is the idea that different materials or voxels, which are like the terrain on the ground, have, well, different hardness. If it's something like sand or snow, for example, if you hit it with a ship, it will create a much bigger crater and you'll go through it for longer, but if you hit something hard like rock, or for example an asteroid, your ship will take more damage and the rocks will take less damage. So it's just a bit more realistic. And whilst we're making holes in the ground, let's look at some ones that are already pre-made. Space Engineers 2 has new voxel technology which allows caves, overhangs and arches to naturally appear in the world. In Space Engineers 1, mountains just went straight up, there was no little bits jutting out, they just had to go up until they reached a peak, whereas in Space Engineers 2 you can see they have little bits poking out, little overhangs, and also indents for things like caves and arches. And this all makes terrain in Space Engineers 2 look so much more realistic and varied. With all the new lighting technology in Space Engineers 2, caves look absolutely amazing, especially with all the stalactites hanging down. I really like this, I really like how this looks. Cave bases will definitely be on my list of things to do in the future. And the last feature of planets I want to mention before we move on to survival is clouds. Clouds in Space Engineers 2 are now volumetric and are now 3D objects that actually exist in the world. And because they're real objects in the world, they react to light. You can see that in the sunset, you can see that the light from the star affects the clouds, making them look red. The clouds also cast shadows on the ground below, and additionally they slowly move across the sky, like real clouds do. I'm explaining how clouds work here. And like real clouds, they only go over appropriate biomes, so there'll be less clouds over deserts, for example. A full weather system that takes full advantage of these clouds is coming in a later update alongside water, but for now, these clouds are definitely a beautiful addition to the game. Look, you could just fly into a cloud. I've always wanted to fly into a cloud, and now we can. It's great. Survival mode, the thing that I know most people are interested in. To start with, the new survival mode starts with a brand new tutorial for the game, which might sound novel, but Space Engineers 1, let's say it could have really done with one. This tutorial though is really good. It explains pretty much everything you need to know how to play the game. So I definitely suggest if you're new to Space Engineers, or even if you played Space Engineers before, you definitely check out this tutorial at least once, as it will explain everything you need to know about this new game. It quickly runs you through all of the features of the game, both new and old, whilst making you perform tasks that require those features. And based on what I experienced, I believed it will be a massive help to getting new players into the game. I'm sure I don't need to explain to you how survival mode works, so just know that resources like hydrogen, energy and health have been added in this update, and the jetpack works a little bit differently. By default, the jetpack now consumes energy rather than hydrogen. However, the jetpack has a boost function that when activated will drain the hydrogen in your suit in exchange for making you move faster, which means that running out of hydrogen in Space Engineers 2 won't be as big a deal as it was in Space Engineers 1. There is a new feature in survival called projection building, which, whereas in Space Engineers 1, you need materials in your inventory and you place down frames of blocks, in Space Engineers 2, you don't need resources in your inventory. You place down a projection instead, which shows the projection of the block you wanted to build, and then you walk up to it with a welder, and then when you have the resources you need, you then can weld it up. Additionally, projection building gives you access to features like symmetry and undo and redo and partial copy and paste. So now you have access to all the game's creative mode building tools in the survival mode. In Space Engineers 1, the easiest way to design and build a ship was to build it in creative mode first, save a blueprint of it, and then project that blueprint into a survival world. But now in Space Engineers 2, there's no need for that, as you have access to all of the building tools in survival mode. And speaking of blueprints, this also means that you can just paste in blueprints in survival and just start welding them up, whereas in Space Engineers 1, like I said, you need a projector. And as you can see when I pasted in that blueprint, it automatically created supports for it, so that the projection isn't just floating in the air. Genuinely messing around with this is a 10 out of 10 feature, and it is a absolutely monumental improvement over Space Engineers 1. Mining has changed from Space Engineers 1. For starters, in Space Engineers 2, there's no longer any stone. If you mine a stone voxel, you're just removing it. Nothing goes into your inventory. But as you can see when I mine an ore, it goes straight into my inventory, which is another change from Space Engineers 1, as in Space Engineers 1, the ore will drop on the ground. But I know some Space Engineers 1 veterans are worried about this change, because stone was the main way to get resources in the early game of Space Engineers 1. And I can promise you that this system is improved in every metric over Space Engineers 1. For starters, in Space Engineers 2, the ore detector in your drill has a massive range increase, going from 50 meters in Space Engineers 1 to 130 meters in Space Engineers 2, so it is much easier to find ores by yourself in the early game. And additionally, from what I played, it feels like you get much more resources from when you mine ore in the game, or alternatively, you need much less resources in order to weld up blocks in Space Engineers 2. Either way, there is a lot, and I mean a lot less mining in the early game of Space Engineers 2. There's still some, you still need to mine ore to get started, but you don't have to spend hours underground mining stone in order to get a meager amount of resources to build these starting blocks in Space Engineers 1. It is so much more streamlined in Space Engineers 2. There's two more changes to mention to mining. One, as with the drill having an increased ore detector range, the ore detector blocks also have increased ranges, with the larger ore detector having a 350 meter range, which is far more than Space Engineers 1 ever had. And additionally, there is also an option on the ore detector blocks to filter to certain ores. So say you only wanted iron ore, you can go through the filter and untick the stuff you don't want to only show iron ore on your HUD. A massive quality of life change. And as you can see from this list of ores here, there are additional ores in Space Engineers 2, like copper and lead. We know that different ores will be located in different sectors in the game. However, currently we have access to all of the ores in the game from the two sectors that are currently in the game, but we'll talk about that more later on. Going alongside the massive improvements to the game projection building and the mining changes we just mentioned, there's backpack building, which is a third feature which massively improves the early game of Space Engineers 2. In Space Engineers 2, there are 4 different types of components, with the 4 different machines making them, the smelter making basic ones, and the assembler, refinery, and the fabricator all making their own different components as well. However, the basic components can also be made in your backpack automatically. If you go up to a block and start welding it, if you have the appropriate ores in your inventory, your suit will then craft those ores as you weld into the components that this block requires. If I press R, you can see that I can switch to the component view, and this is the components it crafts. And if I press R again, you can see the ores that are needed to craft those components. And as I start welding, it will start to craft them using the ores in my inventory. Now, as I said, backpack building only affects the early game components, as all the other components in the game require machines to be built. But this is so much better than sitting in front of a survival kit and slowly waiting for it to convert stone into ingots, and then ingots into a single steel plate, and then placing down a single frame of a block. Oh, it brings me so much pain just thinking about playing Space Engineers 1 from the start again. Like I said, the smelter still crafts the first tier of components, and you still need the smelters to craft those components directly, as those components are both needed to upgrade your tools, and additionally in the future, you'll require basic components to craft the upgraded components in the assembler and the fabricator. So backpack building is not a replacement for crafting, it's just an early game utility to get you over the hump at the beginning of the game. It's worth noting that the current production system in the game is a simplified version of the one that will be in the final game, and I presume, I haven't been told this for certain, that it's been simplified because all of these sectors are not current in the game, and all of the resources in the game are currently found across these two sectors. And additionally, because components are required to craft other components, as we know that the fabricator was due to take all of the components in the game in order to craft endgame components, presumably there'll be some sort of automations to the production system in the future, and that will be able to build some sort of assembly line that turns basic components into the high tier components at the end. But that's not in the game at the moment, so just keep in mind that production has temporarily been simplified and it will change in the future. So, I mentioned a couple of new blocks there, like the fabricator and the smelter, and that's because this update adds a bunch of new blocks to the game. Obviously there are returning blocks from Space Engineers 1, like batteries, atmospheric thrusters and the survival kit, and there are some blocks that were previously in the game that didn't have functionality, like the cargo containers now have storage, conveyors now conveyor up blocks, the antenna now creates a signal on your HUD, reactors now consume uranium and generate power, and stuff like that. Additionally, some of the functionality of these new blocks has changed. One of the most notable examples is the way batteries work in Space Engineers 2, where batteries are a block but they don't store power with themselves. The power is actually stored in the power modules that are on the front of them. If you go up to a battery and hover over the power module, you're able to remove it, and then you're able to place it in a different battery, allowing you to transfer power from one grid to another. So this is very useful if you have things like rovers and ships that you don't want to put connectors on because they don't really need them, not really big enough for them. So you just have a battery in your base that charges up the batteries, and then when they're charged, you just take them out and put them straight into your ship and fly away. An absolutely massive quality of life improvement. Now, this doesn't mean that all the blocks that were in Space Engineers 1 are now in Space Engineers 2. I know things that a lot of people are asking for are mechanical blocks like pistons and rotors and hinges. Those aren't in the game yet. And wheels are another big thing that aren't in the game. But there is an update that's planned to come out around March-April called Vertical Slice 2.2, which plans to introduce those mechanical blocks to the game, so you won't have to wait too long to play around with those. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a couple of new blocks that weren't in Space Engineers 1. The smelter and the fabricator are two I mentioned before, which are production blocks, but there is a third new production block that wasn't in Space Engineers 1 called the Gearforge. And the Gearforge, like its name would suggest, is a block that crafts gear. As you can see on the left, it has all of the tools and their different upgrades over here, and additionally it has consumable items like hydrogen bottles, medkits and batteries. And I'm sure when things like weapons are added to the game, they'll appear here as well. Additionally, there's a new block called the Contract Terminal, which is to do with the colonization system, so let's talk about that. I've done a full video going in depth on the colonization and contract system, so check that video out after this one if you're interested in more info. But the colonization and contract systems were the things I was most interested to see in this update, as they had the potential to either make or break the future of the game. And having played it firsthand, oh, it's so good! So, colonization involves two things, which is the map and the contracts. The map, as you can see here, shows the full Almagest system, and you can see we have our three celestial bodies, Verdure, Kemik and Delfos in the middle, and in the top left, there is a sector called Byblos, and when water is added to the game in the future, there will be a water planet called Byblos added to this sector. If I click on the current sector I'm in, the Verdure sector, you can see up the top right I have 15% colonization progress, and overall I have 1% colonization progress. And colonization is basically the meta loop of Space Engineers. Whilst the game is still a sandbox and you're completely free to do whatever you want, for players that want a progression through the game, the new colonization system is what you want. In order to increase your colonization progress in a sector, you need to complete contracts. At the end of the tutorial for the game, you fly up to this space station here, Velation Station, which begins with a V, and inside you'll find this contract terminal, which is a block that temporarily exists whilst NPCs aren't in the game to give you contracts. And contracts, as you imagine, are like quests. You select one of them, you go to a location, you do some tasks at the location, and you come back and you receive your reward. And as you can see, your rewards are colonization progress, and currently this is the way you unlock additional blocks in survival. It's worth noting before we continue that in the future, completing contracts to unlock blocks will be a toggleable feature, so you can toggle that off and just start with all the blocks that you want. But in the current version of Space Engineers 2, as they want players to interact with the contracts and the colonization system and give feedback on it, they've made it so that this is how you unlock blocks for now. Currently there's only a couple of different contracts in the game. The ones I've seen so far are engineering, hauling and sabotage, and this is because, as I've said before, the game is missing features like NPCs and combat, so the types of contracts they can do currently are limited. And as this is a starting area, these contracts are quite simple, but as more features are added, and additionally as more sectors are added or more contracts are added, I'm sure the variety and the complexity of these contracts will increase. But what we have currently is just a test of how the system works, and from what I've played, I personally think it's very promising for the future, as having something to do in Space Engineers, and having a goal to work towards in Space Engineers, which is colonising the Almagest system, are two things that the game desperately needed. So if they can keep this up and continue to add more contracts that are interesting to complete, I'm sure this feature will be a very big reason to keep people engaged with the game. So aside from unlocking new blocks and watching the colonisation number go up, there's one additional thing you unlock from colonisation, and that's when you fully colonise a sector, you unlock the ability to fast travel from the station that you are currently in to the station in the neighbouring sectors. Now it's important to note what I said there, from the station to the other station. This isn't fast travel like in Skyrim, where you just click on a marker and teleport to it. You specifically need to have your ship inside the safe zone of the station, and then you are able to fast travel to the next one. Now if you want, you can still fly from this station to this other station manually. There's nothing to stop you doing that, other than, time. So if you don't want to engage with the fast travel system, if you don't want to engage with colonisation, if you don't want to engage with contracts, that'll be absolutely fine. You still will need to complete contracts to unlock blocks currently, but in the future you'll be able to toggle that. So there's absolutely no need to worry about this interfering with a normal sandbox experience. And for those wondering about the jump drive, I'll quickly mention it here. It's not current in the game, but we know that the jump drive is planned for Space Engineers 2 as an endgame tool, which will allow you to jump from anywhere to anywhere. So whilst fast travel only gives you station to station travel, the jump drive will in theory be a complete upgrade to it, giving you the freedom to go absolutely anywhere on the Almagest. There's a couple more missed features in the update, but there's only a couple I want to draw your attention to. One is that there are random encounters and unknown signals in Space Engineers 2. So flying around in space, you'll still find stuff like shipwrecks and abandoned stations and stuff like that. They are currently very simple, as without the addition of NPCs, AI for ships, and weapons, there's not really much they can do in that department at the moment. But nevertheless, it's still interesting to explore around you and find stuff. The other feature I want to mention, which is my favourite feature in this update, is auto-docking. That's right, in Space Engineers 2, you fly near a connector and you'll see it glow blue and you're like, oh, there you go, I'm ready to dock. You press P, the forbidden button, and then your ship will automatically move over the connector and land on it. And then you're docked. And that's it. No more messing around, lining up connectors, getting close, waiting for it to glow the right color when you're close enough and then pressing the button. Now it's all automatic. Oh, brilliant. What a game changer. As important as it is to mention features that are added to the game, I think with Space Engineers 2 being early access, it's also important to mention features that aren't in the game. I know there are certain features that players are waiting for, so I'll quickly run through a couple of those that aren't in the game. One of the big things that's been teased in Space Engineers 2 is water, and it has been worked on for almost 4 years now, but it isn't currently in the game. There are ocean beds and river beds in the game, but there's currently no water in them, so that'll be coming to the game at some point next year. The oxygen system is another thing that isn't in the game, as that's coming alongside water. The two systems with pressurization are kind of similar, so it makes sense, so you don't need to worry about oxygen at the moment. There isn't a proper GPS system in the game currently. You can only really leave a marker where you're currently standing, and that is due to come in that vertical slice 2.2 I mentioned earlier, which will be coming out early next year. And additionally, as mentioned earlier, they'll also be adding wheels, pistons, hinges and stuff like that in that update, alongside a bunch of other features as well. So if those are features you're waiting for, you hopefully won't have to wait very long. There's currently no toolbars for ships, as I don't think there's anything that really needs them at the moment. But I'm sure when things like wheels and pistons are added, they'll need a hotbar then, so they'll probably add that in at that point. There's currently no ship grinders and ship welders in the game, which are also coming in that 2.2 update. And I think that's mainly due to the fact that, as I said, there's no toolbar. And additionally, as there's no automatic way to craft components, especially for the welder, I assume they're waiting for that system to be finished before they implement the welder. So I presume there's going to be some sort of production overhaul in this 2.2 update in order to facilitate that. And finally, the big feature I know people are waiting for is multiplayer. Co-op multiplayer is planned to release next year alongside NPCs, and we know that the developers are currently working on this 2.2 update that has all the stuff I just mentioned, a multiplayer and NPC update, and the water update all alongside each other. And whilst the 2.2 update will be coming out first, it's up in the air whether the water update or the co-op update will release first, as whichever one is done first will be added to the game first. And then after they've added co-op multiplayer, they'll be working on full multiplayer after that. And I believe this co-op multiplayer was pushed forward due to player demand, as previously they had planned to release it after water, but now they've put a much bigger priority on it. That being said, I'm much more looking forward to the NPC part of this update. I love my multiplayer, don't get me wrong, but I cannot wait to see what they do with NPCs. Right, game performance. I know this is something that has been on a lot of people's minds. So the first thing to point out is that I'm running this game at the recommended specs of Space Engineers 2, and at mostly maximum settings, I'm able to get perfect performance around 95% of the time. I do get lag when I'm flying around the planet, specifically at very high speeds, as I presume things are loading in front of me and that is causing lag. And additionally, I do get lag when there's a large amount of shadows on the screen, specifically in areas where there are lots of trees and stuff like that. Now, obviously, I could turn my graphics down. I just like to have a pretty looking Space Engineers for videos. And there are lots of different options that drain performance. And some of the options are a big drain of performance, specifically ray tracing. If you're having performance issues in Space Engineers 2 and you have a really good card, I would suggest turning this off because it massively improves the performance of the game. And additionally, the game now supports upscaling. So you can render the game in a lower resolution and upscale it to a higher resolution if your graphics card supports that, which might be a good option for some of you that have weaker PCs, but still want the game to look good. You can just turn on upscaling and upscale it from a lower resolution. I've recorded most of the footage you've seen in this video yesterday, but today the game has received a patch that has noticeably improved the performance for me. So the performance you see in the footage in this video is no longer representative of how the game runs on my PC. And it's worth mentioning that the developers are currently pushing out patches every day to resolve issues at the moment, so any performance issues the game has currently may shortly be alleviated. However, as I previously said, the game is in early access, and the current priority is getting features into the game and getting them to a state that is serviceable for testing, as that is what the early access process is about, and the majority of the optimizations for the game will come towards the end of early access, as it did with Space Engineers 1. At the end of Space Engineers 1's early access development, there was a large optimization push before the game moved to an official release. And those updates took the game from struggling to process a single large ship to being able to support having massive ship battles between many large ships with debris flying everywhere. And this will be similar to how Space Engineers 2 development goes. Like I said though, currently my performance is fine 95% of the time. I probably should just turn down my graphics. It's just worth keeping in mind that the current performance of the game isn't final, just like how everything else in the game isn't final. So, should you get Space Engineers 2? If you're like me and you want to mess around with all the new features and don't mind the early access experience, yes, absolutely, go get it. Otherwise, if you're waiting for a specific feature like mechanical blocks, water, multiplayer, etc., feel free to wait for now. And as always, I'll keep you up to date on when those features are coming and any other new information that we learn about them. So don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel to keep up to date with Space Engineers 2. And if you want to get early access to future videos, you can become a YouTube member or a patron with the links in the description below.